War of 1812. Conflict fought between the United States and Great Britain over British violations of U.S. maritime rights. It ended with the exchange of ratifications of the Treaty of Ghent. Major causes of the war. The tensions that caused the War of 1812 arose from the French Revolutionary 1792 to 1799 and Napoleonic Wars 1799 to 1815. During this nearly constant conflict between France and Britain, American interests were injured by each of the two countries' endeavors to block the United States from trading with the other. American shipping initially prospered from trade with the French and Spanish empires, although the British countered the U.S. claim that free ships make free goods with the belated enforcement of the so-called Rule of 1756. Trade not permitted in peacetime would not be allowed in wartime. The Royal Navy did enforce the act from 1793 to 1794, especially in the Caribbean Sea, before the signing of the Jay Treaty, November 19, 1794. Under the primary terms of the treaty, American maritime commerce was given trading privileges in England and the British East Indies. Britain agreed to evacuate forts still held in the Northwest Territory by June 1, 1796, and the Mississippi River was declared freely open to both countries. Although the treaty was ratified by both countries, it was highly unpopular in the United States and was one of the rallying points used by the pro-French Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, in wresting power from the pro-British Federalists, led by George Washington and John Adams. After Jefferson became president in 1801, relations with Britain slowly deteriorated, and systematic enforcement of the Rule of 1756 resumed after 1805. Compounding this troubling development, the decisive British naval victory at the Battle of Trafalgar, October 21, 1805, and efforts by the British to blockade French ports prompted the French Emperor Napoleon to cut off Britain from European and American trade. The Berlin Decree, November 21, 1806, established Napoleon's continental system, which impinged on U.S. neutral rights by designating ships that visited British ports as enemy vessels. The British responded with Orders in Council, November 11, 1807, that required neutral ships to obtain licenses at English ports before trading with France or French colonies. In turn, France announced the Milan Decree, December 17, 1807, which strengthened the Berlin Decree by authorizing the capture of any neutral vessel that had submitted to search by the British. Consequently, American ships that obeyed Britain faced capture by the French in European ports, and if they complied with Napoleon's continental system, they could fall prey to the Royal Navy. The Royal Navy's use of impressment to keep its ships fully crewed also provoked Americans. The British accosted American merchant ships to seize alleged Royal Navy deserters, carrying off thousands of U.S. citizens into the British Navy. In 1807, the frigate HMS Leopard fired on the U.S. Navy frigate Chesapeake and seized 4 sailors, 3 of them U.S. citizens. London eventually apologized for this incident, but it came close to causing war at the time. Jefferson, however, chose to exert economic pressure against Britain and France by pushing Congress in December 1807 to pass the Embargo Act, which forbade all export shipping from U.S. ports and most imports from Britain. The Embargo Act hurt Americans more than the British or French, however, causing many Americans to defy it. Just before Jefferson left office in 1809, Congress replaced the Embargo Act with the Non-Intercourse Act, which exclusively forbade trade with Great Britain and France. This measure also proved ineffective, and it was replaced by Macon's Bill No. 2, May 1, 1810, that resumed trade with all nations but stipulated that if either Britain or France dropped commercial restrictions, the United States would revive non-intercourse against the other. In August, Napoleon insinuated that he would exempt American shipping from the Berlin and Milan decrees. Although the British demonstrated that French restrictions continued, U.S. President James Madison reinstated non-intercourse against Britain in November 1810, thereby moving one step closer to war. Britain's refusal to yield on neutral rights derived from more than the emergency of the European War. British manufacturing and shipping interests demanded that the Royal Navy promote and sustain British trade against Yankee competitors. The policy born of that attitude convinced many Americans that they were being consigned to a de facto colonial status. Britons, on the other hand, denounced American actions that effectively made the United States a participant in Napoleon's continental system. Events on the U.S. northwestern frontier fostered additional friction. Indian fears over American encroachment coincidentally became conspicuous as Anglo-American tensions grew. Shawnee brothers Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa, the Prophet, attracted followers arising from this discontent and attempted to form an Indian confederation to counteract American expansion. Although Major Gen. Isaac Brock, the British commander of Upper Canada, modern Ontario, had orders to avoid worsening American frontier problems, American settlers blamed British intrigue for heightened tensions with Indians in the Northwest Territory. As war loomed, Brock sought to augment his meager regular and Canadian militia forces with Indian allies, which was enough to confirm the worst fears of American settlers. Brock's efforts were aided in the fall of 1811, when Indiana Territorial Governor William Henry Harrison fought the Battle of Tippecanoe and destroyed the Indian settlement at Prophetstown, near modern Battle Ground, Indiana. Harrison's foray convinced most Indians in the Northwest Territory that their only hope of stemming further encroachments by American settlers lay with the British. American settlers, in turn, believed that Britain's removal from Canada would end their Indian problems. Meanwhile, Canadians suspected that American expansionists were using Indian unrest as an excuse for a war of conquest. Under increasing pressure, Madison summoned the U.S. Congress into session in November 1811. Pro-war Western and Southern Republicans, war hawks, assumed a vocal role, especially after Kentucky war hawk Henry Clay was elected Speaker of the House of Representatives. Madison sent a warm message to the U.S. Congress on June 1, 1812, and signed the Declaration of War on June 18, 1812. The vote seriously divided the House 79 to 49 and was gravely close in the Senate 19 to 13. Because seafaring New Englanders opposed the war, while Westerners and Southerners supported it, Federalists accused war advocates of expansionism under the ruse of protecting American maritime rights. Expansionism, however, was not as much a motive as was the desire to defend American honor. The United States attacked Canada because it was British, but no widespread aspiration existed to incorporate the region. The prospect of taking East and West Florida from Spain encouraged Southern support for the war, but Southerners, like Westerners, were sensitive about the United States' reputation in the world. Furthermore, British commercial restrictions hurt American farmers by bearing their produce from Europe. Regions seemingly removed from maritime concerns held a material interest in protecting neutral shipping. Free trade and sailors' rights was not an empty phrase for those Americans. The onset of war both surprised and chagrined the British government, especially because it was preoccupied with the fight against France. In addition, political changes in Britain had already moved the government to assume a conciliatory posture toward the United States. Prime Minister Spencer Perceval's assassination on May 11, 1812, brought to power a more moderate Tory government under Lord Liverpool. British West Indies planters had been complaining for years about the interdiction of U.S. trade, and their growing influence, along with a deepening recession in Great Britain, convinced the Liverpool ministry that the Orders in Council were averse to British interests. On June 16, 2 days before the United States declared war, the orders were suspended. Some have viewed the timing of this concession as a lost opportunity for peace because slow transatlantic communication meant a month's delay in delivering the news to Washington. Yet, because Britain's impressment policy remained in place and frontier Indian wars continued, in all likelihood the repeal of the orders alone would not have prevented war. Stay tuned for our conclusive video about the War of 1812, and don't forget to like and subscribe.